Hi everyone, Krista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we continue our death record series where we'll be talking about alternatives to death certificates. If you joined us 2 days ago, we talked about where and how to find death certificates. And one of the things that we talked about was that death certificates are, here in the United States, a fairly new type of record. Most states didn't start requiring death certificates until the early 1900s. And so if you're looking for people before then, or if you're looking for people in the early 1900s in states or areas that weren't yet compliant with some of those laws, then there needs to be some alternatives to finding that information about your ancestors. That's what we're going to focus on today as we talk about some of these alternative places where you can find information about the death of an ancestor besides just a death certificate. Let's dive in. One of the first and most obvious places that you're going to find an alternative to a death certificate is going to be an obituary. Now, obituaries have been kept in newspapers for a couple of centuries at least. Not always full coverage of everybody that died in the community, but certainly it's worth looking into. Ancestry.com has a fairly large newspaper collection. Here's how you're going to find that. If you hover over search, and scroll down to that card catalog. The card catalog is a listing of all of the databases contained on Ancestry.com. We're up to 31,018 databases. You'll notice those databases have millions, sometimes tens of millions of records in them. Now, you can filter this card catalog best by using these filters over here on the left-hand side. You'll notice we have one for newspapers. You can click on newspapers again, and then you can filter by location. So I could click on U.S., and if my family was from the state of California, I could click on California. And now what I'll see here is a listing of all 64 newspaper titles that come out of the state of California or that pertain to the state of California. Let me just focus on this first one here for just a minute. This is our historical newspapers birth, marriage, and death announcement collection. It runs from 1851 to 2003. I'm going to open this up here in a new window just so we can see, so we can come back to our search results there, or our card catalog results there in just a minute. This particular database contains newspapers from 7 different major metropolitan areas. So Atlanta, Georgia, Boston, Massachusetts, Chicago, Illinois, Hartford, Connecticut, Los Angeles, California, New York, and the District of Columbia. So those major metropolitan areas have major newspapers, and those major newspapers go back into, as you can see here, the mid-1800s for the New York Times, the late 1800s for the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe, mid-1800s for the Chicago Tribune, all the way back to 1791 for the Hartford Courant out of Connecticut. And some of them, like the New York Times, come all the way up to 2001. And so this particular database, what it is it's just a series of clippings. It's not the entire newspaper, but it's a series of clippings of birth, marriage, and death announcements from those very specific newspapers. So I could come in here and I could type in, I'm looking for this great-great-grandfather of mine. I know he lived in Los Angeles, California, and I'm going to go ahead and click search. And what you'll see here is that it will come up with listings of the newspaper and the date and then the type of event that we're looking at. So if I was only interested in those obituaries, I could say I want to see obituaries, mark that exact, and then it will filter out all of those other announcements, and all I will see is here then a listing of obituaries. I could go through those one at a time, or if I know a little bit more, for example, I happen to know that he died, I think, sometime in the 1950s, and we'll talk in a couple of days about how to narrow down that window so that if you don't know the death date exactly, you have a little bit more control over that search. I could mark any one of these pieces of information exact. I know it was Los Angeles. I'm fairly certain that his last name, well, I know his last name was spelled that way. I'm going to hope that the OCR engines that read these are going to pick those up. And I just slowly filter my results down. I now have 117 results, and then I can just go through those either one at a time or narrow it down with some additional information. So if I zoom out, let me just show you what these are going to look like. Let's try clicking the correct button. If I zoom out, what you're going to see here is that it is just a clipping out of the New York Times for this particular obituary. Now this specific obituary is not for my family, so then I would move on to the next one. That's how this historical newspapers, birth, marriage, and death announcements collection works. Again, it's just for those 7 major metropolitan areas. I can mark obituaries exact in my search. I can mark the city exact in my search. I would recommend leaving the names a little bit fuzzier because these newspaper clippings, all newspaper clippings on Ancestry.com, are machine indexed. It's what we call OCR, where a machine reads them, and sometimes it gets some of those characters right, and sometimes it doesn't get them exactly right, depending on how clear or fuzzy the original newsprint was, and then how clear or fuzzy the microfilming of that was from which we digitized those images. Lots of generations of imaging involved there that could deteriorate the quality of the OCR. But we do know that the dates and the places are exact, and so we can mark those exact, leave those names as default, and do our searches that way. Really great database if your family members lived in any of those major metropolitan areas for birth, marriage, and death announcements, but in this case, particularly for those obituaries. Excellent, excellent resource, over 1.5 million records. Now you'll notice there are also other newspapers. I use the state of California as an example, so let's just look at one of these. If I was looking for an obituary out of Oakland, for example, the easiest thing to do is to just go ahead and open up that database, and you can read the database description. It will give you information about the years that are covered. So the description here, or the title here, doesn't always provide that information on the newspapers. And so the best thing to do is to come over here, read this database description, where you'll discover this database contains newspapers for the following years: 1895 to 1897, 1900 to 1901, 1904 to 1915. So you'll notice there's a couple of year gaps in between some of these sections. It looks like 1938 is missing, 1942 and 3 are missing, 1945 is missing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Hopefully it's not the year that you need the obituary for, but we do try to provide you with as much information. So I would recommend always that you read that database description before you just start searching, because if you were looking for something in 1902, that particular year for this particular newspaper happens to be missing. Usually it's because that original newspaper wasn't microfilmed, and like I said, we received these digital images off of images that were microfilmed. So again, you're going to filter down to newspapers, filter down to the location that you're interested in. Once you find a title for the area of and pay attention to regions. Look at a map. Just because your ancestor was from a specific town doesn't mean that their obituary might not have run in a larger newspaper in a neighboring town. Also, look for obituaries when you're searching for obituaries for your ancestors. Remember to look in places they used to live. So I have family members who moved to other states, and obituaries ran not just in the state where they lived, but also in their home state. And so I've been able to find, if I couldn't find an obituary in one place, looking in that other place sometimes yields those results. Also keep in mind that you can look for an obituary where their parents might live if they died a little bit younger, or or where some of their children live if they've been a part of that community at all. So sometimes you have to get a little creative to find those obituaries. If Ancestry.com does not have the obituary or the newspaper title that you are looking for, I would also recommend that you contact the local library where your ancestor lived and see if they have copies of their historic newspapers on microfilm. Sometimes they'll look that up for you for free if they've got a research librarian. Sometimes they'll ask you to submit a few dollars, $5, $10, $12 for a lookup and copying of that information. And sometimes you might have to actually go visit in person, put that on a to-do list for your next research trip or family vacation to that area. But local libraries are a treasure trove of information information for genealogy, but specifically for local newspapers. So that's obituaries. Excuse me. The next thing we're going to talk about as an alternative to a death certificate might seem a little obvious to some of you, but look for tombstones or cemetery records. Now, tombstones and cemetery records are not the same thing, and so let me just make the differentiation there. There are excellent resources for tombstones on Ancestry.com. We have an agreement with Find a Grave, findagrave.com, which is one of the largest free volunteer-run tombstone photo upload locations on the internet, and there are so many tombstones and cemeteries that have been cataloged through Find a Grave, and you can now search those on Ancestry.com. So I could come in here and filter down to death, and then I could filter down to U.S., and then if I was interested in a specific state, let's look at Iowa, for example. I'm going to see all the different kinds of death records for Iowa, but what I'm looking for specifically is that Find a Grave index, which you can now search directly on Find a Grave or through Ancestry.com. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that when you search on any database on Ancestry.com that starts with the word web, what that means is that we have copied, or we're searching actually their database, and so when you find what you're looking for, we're actually going to take you out of Ancestry.com and into their website so that you can see a copy of that particular record on their website. We didn't actually copy those records or import those records into Ancestry.com. We're just pointing you to where they exist elsewhere on the web. So Find a Grave records, we have those for every U.S. state, and I think we're starting to import the index for some of those in other countries as well. Really excellent resource. You'll see that there are tombstone photos. Sometimes those tombstone photos are readable with the image that you have available to you. Sometimes you have to come out here and see what has been entered. If you're not sure or certain of the information, if you want further information or documentation, you can contact the submitter. So for example, it looks like this person has not just copied what was on the tombstone, but has also entered a little bit of additional information, as well as there have been links created for a parent and a spouse and a child. So you could contact the submitter to see if they have additional, or the creator, to see if they have additional information, where they got that information, what their source was. Always try to look for those original sources where you can. But Find a Grave is an excellent resource for tombstone photos. Cemetery records are a little bit different. Cemetery records are actually the paperwork behind the purchase of a plot or of a section of a cemetery. Not all cemeteries keep those records. Not all cemeteries are willing to share those records. But once you find or suspect you know where your ancestor is buried, it does not hurt to contact the cemetery directly. I usually will just Google the name of the cemetery to see if they have an email address. I always try to contact them by email first where possible, so I can write out the information about my request. If they do not respond, or if there is no email address available, my next step would be to make a phone call to that cemetery. I have contacted cemeteries on a regular basis. One of the more amusing situations, we found my great-great-grandmother buried in a cemetery in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I called the cemetery. They did not respond to my email, so I called the cemetery and I asked if they had any additional information. Most importantly, what I was looking for, because the face of her tombstone was no longer readable, what I was looking for specifically was a corroboration of her death date and her birth date, as well as who purchased the plot, and if there was an obituary or any additional information or a copy of her death certificate that had been copied to or provided to the cemetery upon the purchase of that plot. At which point, the office staff at the cemetery informed me of, they gave me that information. They gave me her birth date and her death date. They gave me actually the location or the address where she was living when she died. And then they gave me the name of the person who purchased the plot, which was a brilliant piece of information for me because it turned out to be one of her granddaughters, and I had not known who her granddaughters had married. And so now I had a married name for one of those granddaughters. And then the staff at the cemetery informed me that the plot was actually not purchased. It was leased, and it had only been leased for 80 years, and did I want to renew that lease? And what ensued was a rather comical discussion, because at that point I had never heard of such a thing, and I was trying to figure out exactly what that meant, and was someone trying to put one over on me, when no, in fact, that's a very common thing, especially in Louisiana in particular, where cemeteries are leased for, or a plot is leased for 80 or 100 years, and then the person is removed so that the space is made available for other people. So those cemeteries can provide you with a lot of additional information. They did not have a copy of her death certificate, and I had written to the state of Louisiana, and they had not had a copy of her death certificate, so I did not end up with that, but I did end up with a lot of really excellent information out of those cemetery records once I discovered where she was buried. So that's a great alternative. Another alternative, particularly as we start moving back into the 1800s and the 1700s, are probate records, wills, in particular. Now, Ancestry.com does, again, have quite a few of those available online. So if we just come in here, we're going to reset our filters. We're going to scroll down here. These are considered like a legal document, and so it's going to be with all of the legal documents, tax, criminal, land, and wills. And you'll see here wills, estates, and guardian records. And then again, I can filter by whatever location I want. You'll see here we've got Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania wills from 1682 to 1819. So those go back quite a ways. Abstracts of wills out of New Jersey and Virginia and North Carolina. So check that and see. What that will do is it will give you information, excuse me, about when your family when wills were probated for anybody in that family. It'll also provide you with a snippet, usually, of the relationship so that you know you have the right person. So here we have, for example, Abigail Lippincott is named in a will as a sister, and it looks like to Sarah Lippincott is who that will is for. And she's left left parts of her property to these people. So this is just an abstract. It's what we call an abstract. It's not a complete copy of the will. It's just the pertinent information about the people and the relationships have been abstracted into this. The reference or the source for that, here is the book. It's book 6 and it's page 287. The will was dated the 8th of February 1816. So we know Sarah was alive at the time that the will was dated. The will was proved the 10th of June, 1816. So she was alive in the 8th of February and she was dead by the 10th of June. So that helps narrow down that window of time for when she could have died as you start to look at some of these probate records. Now, if you want a copy of the original, because we always want to get as close to that original source as possible, you can always come here to the database description, scroll down, and you can see that Ancestry.com received this data from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So you could contact them with that book and page number and see if you can get a copy of that original document. See if it has any additional information than what's been provided in the abstract that might help you narrow down the date of death and any more information about this person. Excellent, excellent resources. Wills, for me, are probably one of the #1 resources for putting early 1800 and late 1700 families together. They're such rich resources because they provide all of those relationships. It helps you know you've got the right person. It helps separate out people of similar names, and as shown there, it helps narrow down some of those lifespans with that date that the will was written and the date it was proven. Another similar document to a probate record, or one that's often created around the same time, are guardianship papers. Guardianship papers are to care for minor children or dependent adults. And keep in mind that just because a woman is still living did not mean that her children did not require guardianship. Here's what I mean by that. If a husband died and the woman was left with underage children, oftentimes at different periods of our history and in different places in the country, those children were still considered orphans, even though their mother was still living. And so guardianship papers would be filed so that an uncle or a neighbor or a cousin or a brother could step in and help take care of that woman and her underage children. You're going to find those guardianship papers in that same place. As a matter of fact, if you look, the category here is actually wills, estates, and guardian records. And so look for any of that guardianship type document. If it's not available on Ancestry.com, the places where you're going to find those offline are going to be county courthouses in the county where your ancestor lived, or possibly local or state archives. Oftentimes, like I'll check the Virginia, for example, the Virginia State Archives has a series of guardianship papers. You can go to their website, you can pull up their catalog, and it will tell you exactly what counties and what time periods are covered in the collection that they have. And once you have that information, then you can contact them. So that's how guardianship works, and it gives you, again, it helps narrow down the date and the place of death for the person who passed away. Estate papers, we do have some of those as well. Those are going to be more likely to be found in archives and libraries. So if your ancestor had property that needed to be managed or sold upon their death, it's a little bit different than a will where they leave property or to people. Estate papers have to do with the sale of property or the disposition of property outside of probate. Look for those as well. And then finally, one of the final alternatives to death certificates, and this one is a little bit out of the box, and this one is most useful in the 1900s, where you just can't find a death certificate. Check with hospitals and funeral homes in the area where you think your ancestor may have lived. Sometimes those hospitals will have records, sometimes they'll even have copies of the death certificate that was or should have been filed with the state. Funeral homes, oftentimes, if they're not connected with the cemetery, if it's a separate place, will also have sometimes copies of the death certificate, copies of the obituary. It's certainly worth doing a little bit of digging and making a few phone calls to discover. So there you have it, several alternatives to death certificates, particularly those top ones for the time period before death certificates were issued in most states in the early 1900s. Those are excellent, excellent resources. I have found obituaries. I think the earliest obituary I have in my possession is 1803. I have found probate records back into the mid-1700s. So certainly worth digging into and looking for those records so that you can narrow down that time and place of your ancestor's death. Good luck in your search. We will continue our series about death records next Tuesday. If you're watching this live, as always, I'll be available on chat immediately following the broadcast. If you're watching an archived version of this on our YouTube channel, feel free to leave a comment. I do monitor those and will answer as I can. If you have suggestions for topics you'd like to see discussed in the future, you can email me at ask@ancestry.com with your suggestions. And then be sure to check our Facebook page. Click on that events tab to see the topics, times, and dates for our future broadcasts so that you can join us. Until next time, this is Krista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.